I was completely stunned because if she is the real heir, then who am I? The freezing Boston wind bit into my cheeks as I stood staring up at the towering glass skyscraper of Miller Enterprises. My name is Beatrix Miller, and at 24 years old, I was finally back where I belonged after a long exile. 6 years ago, my stepmother convinced my father to send me away to Europe for what she described as a necessary challenge for a future leader. She insisted that I needed to prove my worth independently, but deep down I always suspected it was a calculated move to isolate me from the center of power. I spent those years working hard while waiting for the day I could return to take my rightful place at the head of the table. Just 1 month ago, I received a strange and urgent email from my father asking me to return immediately as an undercover intern to evaluate the company one last time. He explicitly warned me in that message not to reveal my true identity to anyone until he gave the signal. That was the last time I heard from him because my calls went unanswered, while my stepmother simply claimed he was receiving treatment for his heart condition in Switzerland. The heavy silence between us was terrifying, but I knew I had to follow his instructions to uncover what was really happening inside Miller Enterprises. I adjusted my cheap coat before pushing through the heavy revolving doors to begin my first day as a complete nobody in the empire I was born to lead. Welcome back to the channel for another incredible story about family secrets and sweet revenge, so please make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The welcome party was held in the company's main atrium, which had been transformed into a dazzling display of wealth and power meant to impress the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers suspended from the high vaulted ceiling cast a shimmering glow over the crowd of investors and high-ranking executives who were busy congratulating themselves on another profitable quarter. I stood near the back of the crowded room, trying to remain inconspicuous alongside my new colleague Caleb, who looked uncomfortable in his slightly ill-fitting suit as he scanned the room nervously. He was clutching a heavy silver tray of expensive appetizers he had been ordered to pass around to the guests, despite being hired for administrative work which showed just how little the management cared about role boundaries. It was infuriating to witness how the dedicated regular staff were treated like invisible servants, while the executives indulged in premium champagne and empty self-congratulatory speeches about family values. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of privileged conversations that completely ignored the reality of the workers supporting their lifestyle. A sudden and respectful hush fell over the chattering crowd as the main spotlight swept toward the grand marble staircase to reveal a woman descending with the practiced grace of royalty. I watched from the shadows as the master of ceremonies introduced the guest of honor to the thunderous applause of hundreds of oblivious attendees. A cold knot of anger tightened in my stomach when I identified the woman basking in the adoration of the room as Sabrina. She was being introduced to the world as the lost daughter of the CEO and the rightful future of Miller Enterprises, which was a lie so audacious it made my blood boil. The sheer arrogance of her deception was staggering because she had absolutely no biological claim to this company or my father's legacy, yet she walked as if she owned every brick in the building. She reached the bottom of the stairs wearing a white silk gown that likely cost more than what most of the employees here earned in a year, and waved to the board members with a predatory smile. Caleb was moving diligently through the dense throng of expensive suits when a boisterous guest knocked firmly into his shoulder without even glancing back to apologize. The heavy tray in his hands tipped dangerously before a full glass of deep red Cabernet launched itself directly onto Sabrina's pristine white gown. The sound of shattering glass was immediately followed by a high-pitched shriek that silenced the entire room and brought the string quartet to a screeching halt. The crimson stain spread rapidly across the white silk fabric like a gruesome wound, while everyone stared in horrified silence at the disaster unfolding before them. Sabrina looked down at her ruined dress with eyes that burned with pure malice before stepping forward to slap the remaining glasses from Caleb's tray in a fit of uncontrollable rage. The crash of crystal against the marble floor echoed through the silent atrium as she pointed a manicured finger in his terrified face and began to scream. "You clumsy idiot, because do you have any idea how much this designer dress costs or who I am?" she yelled while Caleb cowered under her intense fury, unable to find the words to apologize. "You look like you could not afford the thread this is made of, much less the cleaning bill for such a masterpiece, so get out of my sight." She turned sharply toward a man rushing over who was the department manager, Gavin, and demanded immediate retribution for the accident that had ruined her grand entrance. "Get this trash out of my sight immediately, Gavin, because I want him fired and blacklisted from the entire industry by tomorrow morning for his incompetence." Caleb was shaking so badly he could barely speak to defend himself, so I knew I could not stay in the shadows any longer, despite the risk. I stepped out from the crowd and positioned myself firmly between Caleb and Sabrina's fury, with a calmness that surprised even me, given the circumstances. It was clearly an accident caused by that guest pushing him, and not negligence on his part, so you cannot fire him. I stated with a loud authority that made several people turn to look in surprise. Firing an employee for an accident caused by a third party without a proper investigation is a violation of state labor laws and grounds for a wrongful termination lawsuit. I kept my voice steady and professional, ensuring that I did not give away any hint of my true identity or my personal connection to her. Sabrina looked at me with open shock, because she clearly never expected a lowly employee to speak to her with such direct confidence in front of her guests. She narrowed her eyes, trying to place my face, but 6 years abroad had changed me enough to keep my identity hidden from her view for now. "Who do you think you are, speaking to me like that when I am the heir to this company and you are nothing?" she hissed, while taking a threatening step closer to invade my personal space in an attempt to intimidate me. "I can fire you right along with him if you don't shut your mouth and learn your place immediately." Gavin quickly stepped in to whisper frantically in her ear while gesturing toward the employee file he was holding, which likely listed me as a simple intern named Beatrix. I saw a flicker of recognition cross his face as he realized I was the new intern mentioned in the paperwork who had started today, but he clearly did not know my last name was Miller. A cruel and twisted smile slowly spread across Sabrina's face as she realized that firing us would be too easy a punishment compared to what she could do. "Actually, Gavin, you should keep them both because I think they need to learn their place through hard work and suffering." She looked at me with a gaze full of venom before declaring loudly that we would regret crossing her on her big night. "Transfer them to the basement warehouse tomorrow morning, where they can rot with the rest of the garbage and work until they pay off this dress." The next morning, the consequences of my defiance arrived in the form of a transfer order that exiled us from the gleaming upper floors down to the suffocating depths of the basement warehouse. The air down here was thick with the acrid smell of mildew and stale cardboard, which stood in stark contrast to the climate-controlled luxury of the executive suites where I should have been working. Caleb and I were immediately tasked with moving heavy crates of archived financial records, which was a grueling form of physical labor, clearly designed to break our spirits and force us to quit. I watched my friend struggle to lift a particularly heavy box, while his face became slick with sweat, yet he did not utter a single word of complaint about the unfairness of our situation. It infuriated me to witness a dedicated employee being treated like a criminal simply because he had been the victim of a clumsy guest and a spoiled heiress who had never worked a day in her life. Just as we were finding a rhythm to the exhausting work, the sharp and rhythmic clicking of high heels echoed against the concrete floor, announcing an unwanted visitor. I turned to see Sabrina descending the metal staircase with a look of pure satisfaction on her face as she surveyed our miserable working conditions. She walked slowly around the small space while running a manicured finger along a dusty shelf and wrinkling her nose in exaggerated disgust at the environment she had forced us into. She stopped directly in front of Caleb, who had paused in his work to wipe his brow, and smiled with a cruelty that chilled the damp air even further. She leaned in close to ensure I could hear every word of the ultimatum she was about to deliver to him. If you quit, Caleb's sick mother loses her company health insurance immediately. Choose wisely. Her threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud long after she turned and strutted back up the stairs, leaving us alone in the silence of the warehouse. I felt a surge of protective rage, but I knew that reacting impulsively now would only jeopardize Caleb's family, so I channeled my anger into investigating the files we were moving. I began organizing a stack of recent shipping manifests that had been carelessly tossed into a corner, trying to make sense of the chaotic filing system. As I sorted through the paperwork, I noticed a series of import documents for high-tech machinery that supposedly arrived last week. However, when I checked the corresponding crate numbers against the physical inventory in the room, I made a startling discovery. The crates listed on the manifest were sitting right there in the corner, but when I lifted the lid of one, I found it completely empty save for some packing peanuts. My heart began to race as I realized I was looking at hard evidence of ghost shipments, which is a classic method used to embezzle corporate funds by paying for goods that never existed. I frantically flipped through the rest of the documents and found that millions of dollars had been signed off for these phantom deliveries over the past 3 months. My eyes widened in horror when I reached the authorization line at the bottom of the approvals, because the signature belonged to Dad. However, the handwriting was all wrong because the lines were shaky and uneven, lacking the bold and decisive stroke I had known all my life. It looked as though someone had guided his hand by force, or as if he had signed it while under extreme physical duress or heavy medication. I waited until our designated lunch break to slip out the back exit of the warehouse, because I was desperate to hear his voice and confirm my terrifying suspicions. I dialed his private number with trembling hands, praying he would pick up, but the line just rang and rang until it eventually went to voicemail. Panic began to set in, leaving me no choice but to call the one person I despised more than anyone else in the world to get answers. The phone rang 3 times before Elena answered, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet tone that made my skin crawl even through the speaker. "Elena, I need to speak to Dad immediately because I have urgent questions about some company documents that require his explanation." My stepmother laughed softly on the other end, as if I were a child asking a foolish question before delivering her rehearsed lie. "Oh, Beatrix, you know your father is currently enjoying a much-needed vacation in the Swiss Alps and specifically asked not to be disturbed." I gripped the phone tighter because I knew my father was a workaholic who never took vacations without staying in constant contact with his business. He never takes vacations without his phone, so stop lying to me and put him on the line right now. Stop being so dramatic and let him rest. She snapped coldly before abruptly ending the call and leaving me staring at the blank screen in frustration. Her refusal to let me speak to him confirmed everything. My father wasn't on vacation. He was being isolated and controlled by her. I knew I couldn't fight this alone anymore because the enemy was too powerful, so I reached into my wallet to find the one contact who could help. I pulled out a worn business card I had kept hidden for years, belonging to Mr. Harrison, the family lawyer, whom I knew my father trusted with his life. That evening, under the cover of a heavy snowstorm that blanketed the city in white, I made my way to the suburbs where the streetlights flickered intermittently against the driving wind. I pulled my coat tighter around myself as I stood before the residence of Mr. Harrison, expecting to see the immaculate estate I remembered from my childhood visits. Instead, I was greeted by a property that looked abandoned and unkempt, with overgrown hedges and peeling paint that spoke of a man who had lost his standing in the world. It was heartbreaking to see the home of the most powerful legal mind in Boston reduced to such a state of neglect, which only deepened my suspicion that Elena had destroyed more than just my father's company. I knocked firmly on the solid oak door and waited in the biting cold until the heavy latch finally clicked open to reveal a weary face I barely recognized. Mr. Harrison stared at me with wide eyes through his wire-rimmed glasses, as if he were looking at a ghost from a past life he thought was buried. He quickly ushered me into the warmth of his study where stacks of legal boxes were piled haphazardly against the walls, like a barricade against the outside world. I wasted no time in telling him about my return as an intern and the terrifying discovery of the shaky signature on the fraudulent shipping manifests I had found in the warehouse. He listened in silence while pouring 2 cups of strong tea, his hands trembling slightly before he finally sat down to explain the catastrophe that had befallen our family. I cannot help you officially because Elena fired me 3 months ago and blocked my access to every single system, including your father's medical records. He admitted with a voice heavy with defeat and frustration. She accused me of senility and mismanagement to the board, effectively destroying my reputation, so that no one would listen when I tried to raise the alarm about her spending. My blood ran cold at his confession because it meant Dad had been completely defenseless against her machinations for months, without his most loyal protector to guard his interests. But Mr. Harrison was not finished as he leaned forward to deliver a revelation that would completely shatter my understanding of the current situation. He pulled a dusty file from beneath his desk and slid a series of old photographs and birth certificates across the mahogany table toward me with a grim expression. You need to know who you are really fighting because Sabrina is not your father's long-lost daughter as the press releases claim, he stated with a grim intensity that frightened me. She is Elena's biological daughter from a previous marriage, whom she has hidden away for years until she could forge the necessary adoption papers to insert her into the Miller family line. I stared at the documents in horror, realizing that the woman tormenting us at the office was a complete stranger with absolutely no blood relation to the Miller legacy. Elena had orchestrated a long con of terrifying proportions, intending to replace the legitimate heir with her own flesh and blood to seize total control of the empire. We pieced together the timeline and realized that the vacation in Switzerland was actually a kidnapping disguised as medical treatment. They were likely keeping my father heavily sedated in a remote sanatorium to force him to sign over his power of attorney and transfer his assets to Sabrina before his heart gave out. The shaky signature I had seen on the manifest was proof that he was fighting them, but his strength was clearly fading fast under their abuse. Mr. Harrison looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear, advising me that fighting them now might be too dangerous, given their control over the narrative and resources. However, the image of my father lying helpless in a hospital bed while those 2 imposters lived luxuriously on his hard-earned money ignited a fire in my chest. I stood up and slammed my hand down on the table, refusing to accept defeat when we were so close to the truth. I won't let them steal my father's legacy because I'll get the evidence right here inside the company, I declared, with a fierce determination that seemed to spark a new life in the old lawyer's eyes. He nodded slowly as he realized that the little girl he once watched play in the office had grown into a woman capable of fighting this war. We spent the next hour formulating a dangerous 2-pronged counterattack that relied on perfect timing and absolute secrecy. Mr. Harrison would use his remaining old-school contacts and leverage his personal savings to fly to Switzerland immediately to physically locate and rescue my father. Meanwhile, I would return to the Wolf's Den to secure the digital proof of embezzlement from Sabrina's computer to ensure they went to prison forever. You find the digital paper trail that links Elena to the theft, and I will bring Douglas home, Mr. Harrison promised as he walked me to the door. But be careful, Beatrix, because if they realize you know the truth, they will not hesitate to silence you permanently. I nodded solemnly at his warning before stepping back out into the freezing night air, the biting cold no longer bothering me because the fire of retribution burning in my chest was hot enough to melt the snow around me. 2 days later, the opportunity we were waiting for finally presented itself in the most superficial way possible. Sabrina loudly announced to the entire executive floor that she required an emergency spa treatment to prepare her complexion for the stress of the upcoming CEO announcement ceremony. She swept out of the office with her entourage in tow, leaving the executive suite unguarded for a precious window of approximately 30 minutes. I stood by the water cooler and gave a subtle nod to Caleb, who immediately headed toward the basement server room to execute the distraction we had carefully planned. Moments later, a series of urgent alarms began to chirp on the security panels as he successfully simulated a critical overheating error in the main server block. The entire security team abandoned their posts at the elevators and rushed down the stairs to prevent a catastrophic data loss, leaving the hallway to the CEO's office completely deserted. I moved quickly through the silent corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs as I approached the heavy double doors that used to belong to Dad. Pushing them open felt like a violation because the room that had once smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco now reeked of cloying perfume and hairspray. Sabrina had already begun redecorating, replacing my father's dignified mahogany furniture with gaudy, gold-accented modern pieces that screamed of new money and bad taste. I wasted no time mourning the decor and went straight to the massive desk where her laptop sat humming in sleep mode. I woke the screen and was immediately greeted by a password prompt that stood as the final barrier between us and the truth. I tried a few obvious combinations related to the company, but the screen flashed red each time, denying me access. I closed my eyes and tried to think like her, wondering what a narcissist who was obsessed with her mother's approval would choose. I typed in Elena's birthday, adding the year of her marriage to my father, and hit the enter key with a silent prayer. The screen blinked black for a second before the desktop icons appeared, granting me full administrative access to the entire system. I immediately plugged in the encrypted USB drive Mr. Harrison had given me and began scanning her personal folders for the smoking gun we needed. I didn't have to look far because there was a folder arrogantly labeled Family Future sitting right on the desktop. I opened it and felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I read through the chain of emails between Sabrina and Elena. They didn't even bother to use code names in their private correspondence, openly referring to each other as mother and daughter while discussing their scheme. Be patient, my daughter, because once he signs the power of attorney in Switzerland, the entire empire will legally belong to us. One email from Elena read, I am tired of waiting, mother, so just make sure the doctors keep him sedated until after the gala. Sabrina had replied, her callousness displayed in black and white. I quickly selected the entire folder along with the fraudulent bank transfer records I found in her downloads and dragged them over to my external drive. The progress bar seemed to crawl across the screen with agonizing slowness, moving pixel by pixel, while I checked the time on my watch. Just as the transfer hit 90%, the unmistakable sound of sharp high heels clicking against the marble floor echoed from the hallway outside. My blood ran cold because Sabrina wasn't supposed to be back for another 20 minutes, yet the footsteps were getting louder and closer with every second. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket, shattering the silence of the office and nearly making me jump out of my skin. I pulled it out to see a frantic text message from Caleb flashing on the screen. She's coming back. Get out now. I looked at the computer screen where the progress bar was hovering at 99%, teasing me with the salvation of my family's legacy. I forced myself to wait that one final excruciating second until the transfer complete notification popped up. I ripped the USB drive from the port and slammed the laptop lid shut just as the doorknob to the office began to turn. I dove behind the heavy velvet curtains covering the floor-to-ceiling windows just as the door swung open and Sabrina stormed into the room. I cannot believe I forgot my phone on the desk, she muttered to herself, her voice loud in the quiet room. I held my breath, pressing my hand over my mouth as I watched through a crack in the fabric. She walked over to the desk, grabbed her smartphone and paused for a terrifying moment, looking around as if she sensed something was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, she spun on her heels and marched back out, slamming the door behind her. I didn't wait for her to return to the elevator. I scrambled out from behind the curtain and slipped through the narrow service door used by the cleaning staff, clutching the digital evidence that would bring their house of cards crashing down. Later that night, a priority notification lit up every screen in the department, turning the dimly lit office into a sea of blinking red alerts that demanded immediate attention. I watched from my desk as weary employees clicked open the message to reveal a directive sent directly from the private jet of Elena. She announced with great fanfare that she had just landed in Boston after her extended trip abroad and would be hosting a grand, new CEO announcement gala the very next evening in the main ballroom. The message made it clear that attendance was mandatory for all staff members because this was to be the formal coronation of her daughter and the beginning of a new era for Miller Enterprises. The suddenness of the announcement sent a ripple of anxiety through the floor because everyone knew that Sabrina taking power meant mass layoffs and a toxic work environment were inevitable for anyone who wasn't a sycophant. The next morning, the entire building was transformed into a hive of frantic activity as Gavin barked orders at the maintenance crew to construct a massive stage in the center of the atrium. He was obsessing over every detail of the decorations, ensuring that the golden banners bearing Sabrina's face were hung perfectly straight above the podium where she would accept her stolen crown. Meanwhile, Sabrina paraded through the chaos with the smug satisfaction of a queen surveying her conquered kingdom, stopping only to criticize the flower arrangements or the color of the carpet. She looked at the employees scurrying around her with a mixture of amusement and disdain, clearly enjoying the fear she inspired in people who had dedicated their lives to building this company. It was sickening to watch them prepare to celebrate the theft of my father's legacy, but I kept my head down and focused on the mission at hand while waiting for the signal. My pocket vibrated with a single short buzz, and I pulled out my phone to see a message from Mr. Harrison that made my heart leap into my throat. The text was brief, but it carried the weight of the entire world on its few digital characters. I have found him, and we are currently en route to the airport, so please hold the line until we arrive. A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful that I almost collapsed right there in the middle of the busy hallway, because I finally knew I wasn't fighting for a ghost. Dad was alive, and he was coming home to take back what was his, which meant we only had to survive one more night of Elena's deception. I showed the screen to Caleb, who gave me a subtle nod of determination before we quietly slipped away from our assigned tasks to execute the final phase of our counterattack. We navigated through the service corridors until we reached the audio-visual control room, which was temporarily unguarded while the technicians were out for their lunch break. The room was filled with banks of monitors and complex mixing boards that controlled every screen and speaker in the grand ballroom below, where the gala would take place. I located the main presentation computer and quickly found the video file labeled Sabrina_CEO_bio_V final, which was queued up to play at the climax of the ceremony to introduce the new leader. With shaking hands, I deleted the original video file and replaced it with the compilation of evidence I had stolen from Sabrina's computer, renaming it to match the original perfectly. I double-checked that the file path was correct, because we would only get one chance to expose them, and a technical glitch now would doom us all to failure. We slipped out of the room just as the sound engineers were returning from their break, leaving behind a digital time bomb that was set to explode in front of the entire board of directors. We tried to blend back into the workforce, but our absence had apparently been noticed by the one person who was always looking for a reason to punish us. Gavin stepped out from behind a stack of crates near the stage area, blocking our path, with a sneer that twisted his features into a mask of arrogance. He looked us up and down with obvious contempt, clearly relishing the power he held over two lowly employees on the eve of his patron's victory. He stepped closer to ensure his words would sting as much as possible before delivering his final taunt. "Enjoy the party, intern. It'll be your last day here." He laughed at his own threat, expecting to see fear or begging in my eyes, but I simply looked at him with a calm that seemed to unsettle him deeply. I thought about the police officers who would be waiting for him tomorrow, and the prison cell that would replace his corner office very soon. "You're right, Gavin. Tomorrow everything will be different." I didn't wait for his response, or try to explain the double meaning behind my words, because he didn't deserve a warning about the storm that was coming for him. I walked past him with my head held high, feeling the weight of the flash drive in my pocket, and knowing that the time for hiding in the shadows was finally over. The stage was perfectly set for a performance that none of them would ever forget, and I was ready to bring the curtain down on their lies forever. The night of the gala, the grand ballroom was transformed into a sea of luxury and deception, where crystal champagne flutes sparkled under the lights, and the air hummed with the quiet conversation of Boston's elite. 250 of the most influential partners and shareholders filled the room to witness what they believed was a historic transition of power, while Elena played the role of the devoted wife to perfection. She stood on the center stage wearing a shimmering emerald gown that commanded attention, and wiped away a fake tear as she spoke about the difficult decision to let her husband rest while the next generation took charge. I watched from the shadows near the technical booth, with my heart pounding against my ribs, because I knew that behind her carefully crafted mask of sorrow lay a predator waiting to consume everything my family had built. Elena signaled for silence, and the room fell quiet as she gestured dramatically toward the velvet curtains where Sabrina was waiting to make her grand entrance as the anointed successor. It is my great honor to introduce the new CEO of Miller Enterprises, who has shown exceptional talent and tireless dedication to this company," Elena announced, with a voice full of pride. "Please welcome the future of our legacy and my beloved daughter, Sabrina Thorne." Sabrina stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause, looking every bit the triumphant queen she believed herself to be, while Gavin stood by the stairs clapping harder than anyone else. As she reached for the microphone to give her acceptance speech, I locked eyes with Caleb across the room and gave him the subtle nod that would bring their entire world crashing down. The massive projection screen behind the stage flickered for a brief second before the image of Sabrina's smiling professional headshot was abruptly replaced by the jarring sight of the stolen documents. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the internal emails between Elena and Sabrina appeared in high definition, detailing their conspiracy to isolate Dad and siphon millions of dollars into offshore accounts. The screen transitioned to a series of bank transfer records showing unauthorized withdrawals, followed by the undeniable image of Sabrina's original birth certificate, which proved she had absolutely no biological relation to the Miller family. The applause died instantly, replaced by a shocked silence so profound that the hum of the projector fan sounded like a roar in the cavernous room. Sabrina froze mid-step as she turned around to see her secrets exposed to the very people she was trying to impress, while Elena stood paralyzed with her mouth agape in horror. I stepped out from the darkness into the harsh glare of the stage lights and walked steadily toward the podium, while every eye in the room turned to look at the intern they had ignored all night. I pointed an accusing finger directly at the two women who had stolen 6 years of my life and spoke with a voice that echoed through the silent ballroom. "These two are frauds. Sabrina is not a Miller, and Elena has been stealing from this company for years." The accusation shattered Elena's composure completely, causing her facade of elegance to crumble into panic and rage as she realized her meticulously planned coup was disintegrating. She looked around wildly for help, her face twisting into an ugly mask of desperation as she screamed at the security team stationed near the exits. "Seize her! Throw this crazy intern out immediately!" 3 large security guards hesitated for a moment before rushing toward me, their heavy boots thudding against the polished floor as they moved to obey the woman they still thought was in charge. I stood my ground, refusing to flinch even as they closed the distance, because I knew that my reinforcements had arrived just in time. Just as the lead guard reached out to grab my arm, the heavy double doors at the main entrance were thrown open with a force that shook the walls. The entire room turned to see Dad sitting in a wheelchair framed by the doorway, looking frail and thin, but with eyes that burned with a terrifying fire of righteous fury. He was flanked by Mr. Harrison and a squad of uniformed police officers who immediately stepped forward to block the private security guards from touching me. The sight of Douglas Miller alive and present sent a shockwave through the crowd that was palpable because everyone had been told he was too invalid to travel. He raised a trembling hand to point at his wife, and the silence that followed was heavy with the promise of absolute retribution. A deathly silence fell over the room as my father's wheelchair moved forward, parting the crowd like the Red Sea as they scrambled to get out of the way of the man they thought was dying. Mr. Harrison walked faithfully by his side, guiding the chair toward the stage while the police officers fanned out to block every possible exit. Elena stood frozen on the podium like a statue carved from ice, unable to comprehend that her meticulously crafted house of cards had completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Dad stopped at the base of the stairs, and with a trembling effort that showcased his immense willpower, he gripped the armrests of his chair and slowly pulled himself to a standing position. A gasp went through the room as he refused the help of the nurse beside him and stood tall on his own 2 feet to face the woman who had betrayed him. "You told the world I was resting in Switzerland while you kept me sedated in a locked room," he declared, with a voice that was physically weak, but echoed with an undeniable authority that reached every corner of the ballroom. "You forged my signature on transfer documents while I was unconscious and cut off my communication with my own daughter just to steal a company you did not build." The police captain stepped onto the stage and approached Elena and Sabrina, with handcuffs drawn, while reciting the long list of charges against them, including grand larceny, fraud, elder abuse, and embezzlement. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on them, causing their facade of aristocratic elegance to shatter into a pathetic display of cowardice. As the cold metal cuffs clicked around Elena's wrists, she immediately began to scream and point accusingly at her own daughter in a desperate attempt to save herself. It was her idea because she wanted the money for her gambling debts. Elena shrieked while trying to pull away from the officer. "I only did what she asked because she threatened to expose my past secrets, so you cannot arrest me for being a victim." Sabrina looked at her mother with pure hatred and spat at her feet, while the other officer restrained her struggling arms. "You are a lying snake, because you have been planning this since the day you married Douglas. You used me as a pawn to get access to the accounts, and now you want to throw me to the wolves to save your own skin." The guests watched in stunned fascination as the 2 women who had just been presenting themselves as royalty tore each other apart like wild animals trapped in a cage. They were dragged off the stage still screaming obscenities at one another, leaving behind nothing but the ruin of their reputation and a stunned audience. As the commotion of the arrest died down, I noticed movement near the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the stage. Gavin was attempting to slip away unnoticed into the shadows, hoping to escape the purge that was clearly just beginning. "Going somewhere, Gavin?" I called out loudly, causing him to freeze in his tracks as hundreds of eyes turned to follow my gaze. "I believe you were just telling me that tomorrow everything would be different, and you were absolutely right about that." Dad turned his gaze toward the trembling manager and delivered his verdict with a cold finality that left no room for argument. "You are fired, effective immediately, for conspiring against the leadership of this company and aiding in the embezzlement of corporate funds. Security will escort you out, and I will personally ensure that every firm in this city knows exactly what kind of man you are." Gavin slumped his shoulders in defeat as 2 security guards grabbed him by the arms and marched him out of the building he had terrorized for years. With the toxicity finally purged from the room, Dad turned to me and held out his hand, inviting me to join him on the stage where I belonged. I walked up the steps feeling the weight of the last 6 years lifting off my shoulders with every stride I took. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder and looked out at the sea of faces with a smile of genuine pride returning to his face. I apologize for the deception tonight, but it was necessary to expose the cancer that was eating away at this family, he announced warmly. I am stepping down as CEO effective immediately to focus on my health, and I am proud to introduce you to the only person with the integrity to lead us forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my daughter and your new CEO, Beatrix Miller. The applause that erupted was genuine and deafening as I took the microphone to accept the position I had fought so hard to reclaim. I looked down at Caleb, who was still standing near the catering station looking overwhelmed by